Story 4: How the Cymry land became inhabited. In all Britain today, no wolf roams wild, and all the deer are all tame. Yet in the early ages, when human beings had not yet come into the land, the swamps and forests were full of very savage animals. There were bears and wolves by the thousands, beside lions and the woolly rhinoceros, tigers with terrible teeth like sabers. Beavers built their dams over the little rivers, and the great horned oxen were very common. Then the mountains were higher and the woods denser. Many of the animals lived in caves, and there were billions of bees and a great many butterflies. In the bogs were ferns of giant size, amid which terrible monsters hid that were always ready for a fight or a frolic. In so beautiful a land, it seemed a pity that there were no men and women, no boys or girls, and no babies. Yet the noble race of the Cymry, who we called the Welsh, were already in Europe and lived in the summer land with the south. A great benefactor was born among them, who grew up to be a wonderfully wise man and taught his people the use of bows and arrows. He made laws by which the different tribes stopped their continual fighting and quarrels, and united for the common good of all. He persuaded them to take family names. He invented the plough and showed them how to use it, making furrows in which to plant grain. When the people found that they could get things to eat right out of the ground from the seed they had planted, their children were wild with joy. No one ever loved babies more than these Cymry folk, and it was they who invented the cradle. This saved the hard-working mothers many a burden, for each woman had, besides rearing the children, to work for and wait on her husband. He was the warrior and the hunter, and she did most of the labor in both the house and the field. When there were many little brats to look after, a cradle was a real help to her. In those days, brat was the general name for little folk. There were good laws, about women especially, for their protection. Any rough or brutish fellow was fined heavily or publicly punished for striking one of them. By and by, this great benefactor encouraged his people to the brave adventure and led them in crossing the sea to Britain. Men had not yet learned to build boats with prow or stern, with keels and masts, or with sails, rudders, or oars, or much less to put engines in the bowels or iron chimneys for smokestacks, by which we see the mighty ships driven across the ocean without regard to wind or tide. This great benefactor taught his people to make coracles, and on these the whole tribe of thousands of Cymric folk crossed over into Britain, landing in Cornwall. The old name of this shire meant the Horn of Gallia, or Wallia, as the new land was later named. We think of Cornwall as the big toe of the motherland. These first comers called it a horn. It was a funny sight to see these coracles, which they named after their own round bodies. The men went down to the riverside or the seashore, and with their stone hatchets they chopped down trees, they cut the reeds and osiers, peeled the willow branches, and wove great baskets shaped like bowls. In this work the women helped the men. The coracle is made strong by a wooden frame fixed inside the round edge, and by 2 crossboards which also served as seats. when they turned the wicker frame upside down and stretched the hides of animals over the whole frame and bottom. With pitch, gum, or grease, they covered up the cracks or seams. Then they shaped paddles out of the wood. When the coracle floated on the water, the whole family, daddy, mammy, kids, and any old aunts or uncles or granddaddies got into it. They waited for the wind to blow from the south over the northern land. At first the coracle spun around and round, but by and by each daddy could, by rowing or paddling, make the thing go straight ahead. So finally all arrived in the land now called Great Britain. Though sugar was not then known, or for 1,000 years later, the first thing they noticed was the enormous number of bees. When they searched, they found the rock caves and hollow trees full of honey, which had accumulated for generations. Every once in a while the bears, that so like sweet things, found out the hiding places of the bees and ate up the honey. The children were very happy in sucking the honeycomb, and the mothers made candles out of the beeswax. The newcomers named the country Honey Island. The brave Cymry men had battles with the other people who were already there. When anyone, young or old, died, their friends and relatives sat up all night guarding the body against wild beasts or savage men. This grew to be a very settled custom, and such meetings were called a wake. Everyone present did keep awake, and often in a very lively way. As the Cymry multiplied, they built many dons, or towns. All over the land today are names ending in don, like London, Croydon, showing where these villages were. But while occupied in things for the body, their great ruler did not neglect the matters of the mind. He found that some of his people had good voices and loved to sing. Others delighted in making poetry, so he invented or improved the harp and fixed the rules of verse and song. Thus, ages before writing was known, the Cymry preserved their history and handed down what the wise ones taught. Men might be born, live and die, come and go like leaves on the trees, which expand in the springtime and fall in the autumn, but their songs and poetry and noble language never die. Even today, the Cymry love the speech of their fathers almost as well as they love their native land. Yet things were not always lovely in Honeyland, or as sweet as sugar. As the tribes scattered far apart to settle in this or that valley, some had fish, but no salt. Others had plenty of salt, but no fish. Some had all the venison and bear meat they wanted, but no barley or oats. The hill men needed what the men on the seashore could supply. From their sheep and oxen they got wool and leather, from the wild beasts fur to keep warm in the winter. So many of them grew expert in trade. Soon there were among them some very rich men who were the chiefs of the tribes. In time, hundreds of others learned how to traffic among the tribes and swap or barter their goods, for as yet there were no coins for money or bank bills. So they established markets or fairs to which the girls and boys liked to go and sell their eggs and chickens, for when the wolves and foxes were killed off, sheep and geese multiplied. But what hindered the peace of the land were feuds or quarrels, because men of one tribe thought they were braver or better looking than those of another tribe. The women were very apt to boast that they wore their clothes, which were made of fox and weasel skin, more gracefully than those in the tribe next to them. So there was much snarling and quarrelling in Cumberland. The people were too much like naughty children, or when kiddies are not taught good manners, to speak gently and be kind to one another. One of the worst quarrels broke out because in one tribe there were too many maidens and not enough young men for husbands. This was bad for the men, for it spoiled them. They had too many women to wait on them, and they grew to be very selfish. In what might be the next tribe, the trouble was the other way. There were too many boys, a surplus of men, and not nearly enough girls to go around. And when any young fellow, moping out his life alone and anxious for a wife, went a courting in the next tribe, or in their vale, or on their hilltop, he was usually driven off with stones. Then there was a quarrel between the two tribes. Any young girl who sneaked out at night to meet her young man of another clan was, when caught, instantly and severely spanked. Then, with her best clothes taken off, she had to stand tied to a post in the marketplace a whole day. Her hair was pulled down in disorder, and all the dogs were allowed to bark at her. The girls made fun of the poor thing, while they all rubbed one forefinger over the other, pointing at her and cried, "Fie, for shame!" while the boys called her hard names. If it were known that the young man who wanted a wife had visited a girl in the other tribe, his spear and bow and arrows were taken away from him till the moon was full. The other boys and girls treated him roughly and called him hard names, but he dare not defend himself and had to suffer patiently. This was all because of the feud between the two tribes. This went on until the maidens in the valley, who were very many, while yet lovely and attractive, became very lonely and miserable, while the young men, all splendid hunters and warriors, multiplied in the hill country. They were wretched in mind because not one could get a wife, for all the maidens in their own tribe were already engaged or had been mated. One day news came to the young men on the hilltop that the valley men were all off on a hunting expedition. At once, without waiting a moment, the poor lonely bachelors plucked up courage. Then, armed with ropes and straps, they marched in as a whole body to the village in the valley below. There, each man seized a girl, not waiting for any maid to comb her hair or put on a new frock or pack up her clothes or carry a thing out of her home, and made off with her as fast as one pair of legs could move, with another pair on top. At first, this looked like rough treatment for a lovely girl thus to be strapped to a brawny big fellow, but after a while the girls thought it was great fun to be married, and each one to have a man to scold and look after and boss around, for each wife inside her own hut was quite able to rule her husband. Each one of these new wives was delighted to find a man who cared so much for her, and to come after her and risk his life to get her, and each one admired her, his brave new husband. Yet the brides knew too well that the menfolk, fathers, brothers, uncles, and cousins would soon come back to attempt their recapture. And this is just what happened. When a runner brought to the valley men now far away news of the taking of their daughters, the hunters at once ceased chasing the deer and marched quickly back to get the girls and make them come home. The hillmen saw the band of hunters coming after their daughters, and they at once all took their new wives into a natural rocky fortress at the top of a precipice which overlooked the lake. This stronghold had only one entrance, a sort of a gateway of rocks, in front of which was a long, steep, narrow path. Here the hillmen stood to resist the attack and hold their prizes. It was a case of a very few defenders assaulted by a multitude, and the battle was long and bloody. The hillmen scorned to surrender and shot their arrows and hurled their javelins with desperate valor. They battled all day from sunrise until the late afternoon, and when shadows began to lengthen, the stars one by one came out, and both parties, after setting sentinels, lay down to rest. In the morning, again, charge after charge was made. Sword beat against shield and helmet, and clouds of arrows were shot by the archers, who were well posted in favourable situations on the rocks. Long before noon, the field below was dotted, and narrow pass was choked with dead bodies. In the afternoon, after a short rest, and refreshed with food, the valley men, though finding that only 4 of the hill fighters were alive, stood off at a distance with their longbows and shower of arrows, left not one to breathe. Now, thought the victors, we shall get our maidens back. So taking their time to wash off the blood and dust, and to bind up their wounds, and to eat their supper, they thought it would be an easy job to load all the girls on their ox carts and carry them home. But the valley brides, thus suddenly made widows, were too true to their brave husbands. So when they had seen the last of their lovers quiet in death, they stripped off all their ornaments and fur robes, until all stood together, each clad only in her own innocence, and as pure in their purpose as they were a company of druid priestesses. Then, chanting their death song, they marched in procession to the tall cliff that rose sheer after the water. One by one, each uttering the name of her beloved, leapt into the waves. Men at a distance, knowing nothing of the fight, and sailors and fishermen far off in the water, thought that a flock of white birds were swooping down from their eyrie into the sea to get their food from the fishes. But when none rose up above the waters, they understood, and later heard the whole story of the valour of the men and the devotion of the women. The solemn silence of night soon brooded over the scene. The men of the valley stayed only long enough to bury their own. Then they marched home, and their houses were filled with mourning. Yet they admired the noble sacrifice of their daughters and were proud of them. Afterwards, they raised stone monuments on the field of the battle. Today, this water is called the Lake of the Maidens, and the great stones seen near the beach are the memorials marking the place of the slain in battle. During many centuries, the ancient custom of capturing the bride, with resistance from her male relatives, was vigorously kept up. But in the course of time, however, this was turned into a mimic play with much fun and merriment. The